So this panel is being brought to us today by Scottish Television, STV and Old Money. And I want to start by introducing the panel, and then I'll introduce myself. You guys are more important than me. So to my left here, and I'll start with Craig because he's Scottish and I'm biased. Craig is the creative director of Factual at STV Studios. Joined STV in 2019. It just made a fantastic documentary for Channel 4 called What Killed the Whale. His background is actually lead commissioning editor for natural history and specialist factual at the BBC. And he's a very committed climate storyteller. Fehinti, to my right, Fehinti Balogun, is an actor, theatre maker and activist. And he was in the BBC's multi-award-winning TV drama I May Destroy You, which I'm sure many of you loved, and also appeared in the hit feature film June, a climate story actually in itself. We might talk about that later. But Fehinti is also a regular speaker on climate change, and he works with Extinction Rebellion on advocacy. And then Professor Lucy Easthope, who I recently had the pleasure of interviewing at the Hay Festival. Lucy is what I would describe as the outlier and potentially the agent provocateur in this panel. Her job is to challenge you for not being very good at climate storytelling. Lucy is the leading authority on recovering from disaster in the UK. Lucy is a genuine working class hero. I like to say that I'm a working class hero, but Lucy is the real deal. She was inspired to work in disaster after the Hillsborough events around Hillsborough. She is the government's tactical advisor, and she's worked in the aftermath of the London bombings and the Grenfell disaster, and she's a member of the Cabinet Office National Risk Assessment Behavioural Science Expert Group, and that is the worst title for I've ever heard in my life. And then we have Stephen Garrett at the end. And Stephen is familiar to many of you, certainly who work in drama. He would hate me to describe him as drama royalty because I'm not sure how you feel about the royal family. But Stephen is obviously brought the Night Manager, part of the team that brought the Night Manager to our screens, which received 12 Emmy nominations. He's also, obviously, he's recently involved with HBO's limited series, The Undoing, with Nicole Kidman. And he's currently making, in the production of Culprits, a new 8-part thriller for Disney+. And Stephen commentates in the Financial Times and has lectured at Oxford and continues to, certainly lead the way in terms of drama. And I just actually read, I've known Stephen for a while, but I just read that you're an extra in a Milky Bar Kid commercial. Is that true?
I'm afraid so, and I discovered the Milky Bar Kid didn't like Milky Bars, which was very early disillusionment.
That's an extraordinary thing, and I only learned that. That's just, I wish I'd known that earlier. And did anyone see the Milky Bar Kid character? So many people here are too young for that, right? This audience, right? Tamale Kodakari, and Tamale is one of my fellow jurors here at the festival on the climate storytelling, which we could talk about that maybe later, but Tamale is a climate impact producer and co-host of the groundbreaking podcast Mothers of Invention, which she presents with the former Irish President Mary Robinson. And she's advised BAFTA's Albert scheme and indeed the awards here on issues of climate. So my name is Dan McDougall. I'm an international correspondent and film director reporting in 126 countries. Most of these countries have been impacted by climate change in ways that, despite our recent drought, we can only imagine. And I think it's vital that the festival hosts, and that's why we've got a good audience as well, because I think this is an issue that has historically been marginalised, and for all the futures, this is an urgent conversation, probably the most urgent conversation we can have here. So I'm going to start with a really quick question. Now, we've got 5 panellists. We're going to have to rapidly get through it, but the way this session is going to flow is we're going to try and focus on the individual expertise of the panellists, rather than us just having a bun fight up here and arguing, because that's not going to solve anything. But I am going to ask one question to everyone, and I want you to answer it quite quickly. Can anyone, we'll start with Stephen to the right, can anyone give an example of a brilliant, memorable and impactful climate-related drama or doco that you've seen recently or you've seen in the last decade, and you can't say Don't Look Up or Avengers Endgame?
No.
No? Okay, well, that's pretty easy. Okay.
It's not explicitly climate. It had a really big effect on me when I watched it. Avatar, the James Cameron one. About, people being colonised, land being taken, lush land then being thrown away. It had an effect.
Okay. Do you think James Cameron's an environmentalist?
I would know.
Okay, Craig?
Am I allowed to say Edinburgh?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's mine.
Okay, I'm not going to say no. I'm not.
Well, I didn't know if I was going to get it right or wrong. So.
No, I think that's good. Okay, Tamara?
Definitely not dark or scripted, there's nothing I've seen on telly of late, but my favourite piece of climate programming so far is Fehinti's piece, Can I Live? True story.
Oh.
Yeah, the hearts. It's true. It's true. It's a
that's
phenomenal
lovely. That's so nice.
piece of work, and I feel like I see a lot of stuff, but it's very subpar, and that's the only thing I've seen to date.
Well, I think we should all be complimenting each other throughout the panel, right?
Yeah,
that's the best way to go forward.
Yeah.
So, Lucy, you're next.
3 things for me, for people who've come to this session and then will want to go away and perhaps think where the disaster planners are, would be Years and Years, Children of Men, and I've just forgotten the third one, but it'll come to me and I'll bring it up in my answer.
Well, Children of Men would have been mine, but I think the fact that we're struggling, right, in some regard, probably answers the question why we're here in the first place. So, Lucy, we're going to start with you as the kind of outlier here in some respects. You've all these industry executives that you can shout at, which is super. And I think that one of the criticisms we've spoken about in the past, Lucy, and also I'm conscious of as well, is that we don't really cover climate very well, and we don't really cover it in a very accurate way, but also that's the same with disaster movies and with how dangerous is a portrayal of disaster in movies and drama from your perspective?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. And where I'm positioned is I'm at the end. So I'm obviously allied with many people who are activated trying to prevent climate change, but ultimately where the disaster responder sits is when it happens, when we don't meet our targets. And sometimes I think it doesn't matter that it's not always represented accurately, because sometimes the purpose of drama is to escape or to enjoy. During the pandemic, one of the things that my colleagues and I have taken great comfort from is once a month we have a movie night where we dissect a disaster movie for its realism, and that's endured. Actually, we're sort of 36 months in now. It's really been wonderful to do, and perhaps one of the biggest things that is a huge challenge, I think, to the TV world is the mundanity of responding to disaster. So I call it in my new book, the Skyfall effect is the pretense, the idea that we've got eyes on London, or we've got cars that can get us to any point, or we've got technology that will solve this. And actually, the disaster responders and those responding to heat waves and droughts and the excess deaths caused by both right now are people like myself, in cardigans, hoping that there's a decent cup of tea on when you get there. And so we are the antithesis of how you tell a captivating true story. And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges for us. I've remembered the third item I would recommend, which is Spike Lee's Requiem on the Breaching of the Levees, which captures, I think, the conflict between news producers arriving at the scene incredibly well, and Soledad O'Brien's incredible frustration at having to report on things that were both preventable and the loss of life could have been hugely avoided. And that's very difficult. The other thing, of course, in disaster is they don't end. They ebb, they flow, they have good days, they have slightly more hopeful moments, but there are neither heroes nor a story arc. They are just there. And that's very difficult when you need to bring something to a conclusion in maybe an hour or 2 hours.
But part of your job is obviously advising Boris Johnson's cabinet on disaster response. That's a total circus in itself. So that makes perfect TV, because it's just a gathering of mediocrity and incompetence. And by definition, surely that would make good drama.
I believe people have, yes. I think what makes perhaps more compelling reality TV is that layer below, where I spend a lot of my time, which is either with very hard-working civil servants or with operational responders. So I get a lot of requests from reality producers about, could we make a drama, could we make a reality show that's set in how we might look in 2100 if we don't meet the degrees target? Can we look at how people might live? So I've had several several requests along those lines. We have requests in disaster response to wear body cams and show people what we might be discussing now for the future. But that would just be a lot of people, I think, arguing over which is the best type of biscuit and losing an Excel spreadsheet. So I've been asked to wear a body cam several times in the style of things like ambulance or 24 hours in police custody, and I've yet to see how we would make that compelling enough. So I think how we tell the story of this huge amount of diligence that's going on, that's where the hope comes from. There are 10,000 or more emergency planners in the UK who 2003 local authority guidance was updated to show by 2022 you needed to be ready for wildfires. They were as ready as far as they could be, but to return to your point, the problem with central government is they need us to show us the bodies. They have to see the fire for us to resource wildfire. They have to see the dead for us to resource drought or heat wave. Sadly, we're in that position where we are getting a lot more traction, but it's very sad those days had to come.
So I guess what you're, this panel is called Based on a True Story, and the truth is a lot more boring than fiction in some respects, but what you described to me at the end of that is compelling drama. So maybe it's I think maybe I'd like to turn to Stephen actually on this issue, and this is probably one of the key questions we're here, certainly from a philosophical perspective, is it the job of drama to entertain or to inform? So do you have a moral responsibility, or does a genre, to tackle epoch-defining issues like climate?
I think the challenge for us, drama is the most expensive genre to make, and we are so not a cheap date that you are constantly reminded that we are, I don't know what everyone in this room does, but most of us who work in television, whether we like it or not, are in the entertainment business. And those two words are absolutely critical. We're there to entertain, and we're part of somebody else's business. And it's back in the good old days when Reith established the BBC, yes, the mantra of the BBC, at the heart of its DNA and still embodied in its constitution, is to inform, entertain, educate. And the BBC could make shows, and public service broadcasters could make shows that did all those things and know that they would be watched because there was nowhere else to go. We now have limitless choice, and we have multiple global businesses whose motivation is solely to drive subscriptions and avoid churn. Now, oddly, public service at times goes hand in hand with that desire because they want to reach different constituencies. And so you will find on Netflix and Amazon and all the other platforms some genuinely good, thought-provoking documentaries, dramas, other factual programs that deal with the kinds of issues that we want to. But it's a kind of happy accident. I don't think it's part of any benign purpose. As program makers and people who come up with ideas and try to get them made, yes, we have a moral responsibility to try and get those stories told, but you have to deal with the reality that audiences are very sophisticated. They don't like being hit over the head with ideas, so you need to find Trojan horses that kind of come up and bite them on the bum, and they watch something and they don't quite know until afterwards that they've been told something useful, interesting, and dynamic. And I think the reason I was so unhelpfully negative with your first question, I didn't mean to be perverse, but I think there's a distinction to be drawn between programs of any genre that, if you like, tackle the subject, that reflect the true nature of disasters, their causes, and what the consequences are, and something that makes a change, makes a difference, changes behavior. And that's where we struggle, and that's why I came up with a negative. Because you look at a show like Chernobyl, which by any stretch of the imagination is one of the most remarkable pieces of television in our living memories. And at one level you could say that could have been my answer to that question. But what behaviors are going to change as a result of that show? Or Years and Years, which I agree, I thought was remarkable. But I don't know who watches that and changes the way they behave. And in particular, how you change the way that governments behave. Because I think there's just a degree of helplessness that people feel, particularly now. Everyone's lives are so difficult. Given the choice between something that might tell them a little bit more about climate change and how they can stop using plastic bottles at television conferences, they just think, I've got to pay my electricity bill, I've got to feed my kids. I don't need to be hit out of the head about how I should use less water in the shower. And it's change at a governmental level. And to your point earlier, we are dealing with such utter fuckwits in government who are so self-serving, so gratuitously self-serving, and all they care about is how their party is going to win the next election. It's quite bleak. So yes, we'll do our best to come up with those ideas, but how we make that change, I'm open to ideas.
I think one of the things we've all discussed individually as well is this relationship between activism and drama. I mean, the whole issue of the journalist activist is a conversation we could do an hour's panel around. I remember being in the Sudan covering the war and getting a message saying George Clooney's put a satellite above Sudan. Great story. And I'm on the ground in the Sudan trying to tell the story. And it feels that the celebrity oxygen around issues like climate is often a very negative thing. Fehinti is the antithesis of that. He elegantly combines activism and acting. And I'm very interested to hear from you, Fehinti, and how you feel or how you balance your career as an actor by wanting to speak out, for example, through your work with Extinction Rebellion, but also to be the modern actor-activist. And the second component of that story is that, I think I made a pitch to Dorothy Byrne years ago, basically about an idea about celebrity and charity being a bad mix, and the headline was, "What the fuck is Posh Spice doing at the UN?" and I think that space is really interesting because there's a lot of actors that undermine movements rather than enhance them. So I'd be really interested from you as an actor and a creative how you balance that, activism and creativity.
Yeah, cool. Big question.
Just a small question.
Yeah. It's hard, mostly because actually, as Stephen was saying, it's a business, isn't it? It's a business. And we have an sort of idea of what success looks like. And that idea of success is built upon a culture that really values the assets of the 1%, like desperately values it. I was talking to a friend earlier, and we were talking about the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to climate change is like taxing the rich and then taking away ridiculous spending things like super yachts. Like there are just so many things that are needless really, that if you just took away, it would be so easy, actually, and would reduce however many emissions that would equal a small country, but are used for one company or even one person. It's very, very simple things. But actually, in culture, we really... Can I swear?
You've been swearing the whole time.
Oh,
Scotland,
It's Scotland.
It's like, you said fuckwit. 6. We really fucking value money, bruv. It's wild. It's in everything in our culture, and actually we see success. So when it comes to quote-unquote celebrity, who says it? There's an Italian philosopher that calls it cultural homogeny, where the idea of that, the reason that the classes are kept the way they are is because one of the things they do is they make us value where they stand. And we see that reflected in like voting and beliefs that you will deserve or you have earned through your hardship this amazing thing over there that you probably won't get in your life because of how it's set up. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to work forever and ever and ever and then die. And then the people that have... quote-unquote, earned their money are supposed to have that. So that's our conversation. So coming back to the celebrity aspect of it, it's really difficult because actually what the divide in that, or, Posh Spice at the UN or whatever, is Posh Spice there to talk about something, to advocate for something, to explain the root of the cause of an issue, or is she promoting something? And yeah, you could argue, okay, if someone tweets this one thing, then it gets seen by loads of people and that might do a thing, which is great. I think we're past that. We're at a real point where we need to not just be seeing things that perpetuate the idea that the things we're going to have are the things we always had, because that's just not real. I'd like to think that any television show that is produced or any piece of media that's produced that doesn't include climate crisis or some aspect of the world changing is fiction, because it's not real. And these are all, again, perpetuated by the idea that, we're going to get that amazing thing at the end of the road. I'm going to get a seat at the table, the slice of my pie. And that's how you get followers, by showing that I did this thing or I achieved this thing. And there's lots of really complicated ideals. So coming back to myself and what I do, I say, listen, do whatever you can to get that message across. But actually, fundamentally, what we need to do is challenge the culture. And at the end of the day, it's that cultural aspect of where these problems come from that will lead us to a better place. One of the things I say when I'm talking is like, even if a magic technology was created today, right? And it takes out all the harmful gases in the air, and it would make it more clean and easier to sustainably live, what postcodes would that go to? Who would get to use it? So regardless of what technologies exist or what we're doing, it's not aimed in a way that would benefit most of society. So we'd still go that way anyway. And that reflects itself in how I like to talk about work. And then what's really difficult, I've been talking for ages, I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine, it's great. I'm watching the signer actually, and this is really...
Yeah.
You have to say that now.
No, you have to say that we're saying...
There's definitely a joke in there somewhere, but I'm not sure where.
I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But also what's really hard is that you can have that mindset about changing culture, but at the end of the day, we still live in a carbon economy. And so as someone who works freelance, I instead of you, I have felt pressure on sets or pressure when I'm trying to get a job, and I go up to the producers, or I go into their trailer and their vans, and I go, listen, I want to talk about how you aren't reaching these targets and you're not doing this thing because I'm here. You think, well, they could replace me. Or there's someone else who can do this job, or I might not get the next job because I pissed someone off because of talking about this. And there's always that argument within me, personally, and something I've seen with people, is that you aren't rewarded for standing up for what's right, and you shouldn't expect to be, but you aren't. So it makes it very difficult to do the thing that is right. We saw that with Channel 4 at the minute. Like, the privatisation of Channel 4 and, like, the government not allowing certain people to be on the board, that's a hard thing to experience. How are you supposed to be like, I'm going to change this thing if you're going to get punished for it? Anyway, thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Anytime. Fehinti will be available in the foyer later if you'd like to talk to him further. It's great. I mean, talking about this idea of activism and attracting new audiences, I mean, we talked about this as fathers, and Scottish fathers are the best fathers. Well, certainly our generation. I'm not sure the generation before.
Our generation.
And I think that it's interesting for me, surely, as we talk about how we can, attract a new audience without frightening them. And I remember, certainly in the 80s, we had Raymond Biggs, When the Wind Blows. There's a lot of fear created around different stories. From your perspective, do you think that the public service broadcasters have to take a more proactive role in terms of climate storytelling? And we'll talk about another idea in a minute. And I'm going to condense two questions. Should there be a charter compelling them, public service broadcasters, to dedicate a percentage of all drama and documentary output to climate?
Can I answer the second question first? Around the charter, do I think the subject of environmentalism, climate change, is important enough to have a charter? Yes. Do I think it should be written into the charter of public service broadcasters? I don't think so. And I think the reason why is because we work in the entertainment industry, and I think it is really, really important, just what Stephen was saying earlier, that we don't hit people over the head. We don't continually feel that this is another box that has to be ticked. Because if you lose eyeballs because it's boring, you lose the argument. And I think it's really, really important that what we need to get better from everybody who's a producer in this room is to start thinking about how can we bake in the stories of environmentalism and climate change into our long-running, very successful formats so that the audience do get the information, they get it, but without necessarily thinking, I've got to sit down and watch this tonight because it's got climate emergency in the title. And the role of the public service broadcaster, I think PSBs are facing the biggest crisis of their entire history. But yet, this is one area where I think that actually public service broadcasters are incredibly useful. This is the problem of our time. This is a problem of our generation. And public service broadcasters have one thing that I think no streamer has and no other platform, and it's trust. And trust and authenticity is everything when it comes down to this debate. And I think we should be encouraging public service broadcasters to do an awful lot more because the audience are turning to them because they are the trustful, they are the most trusted platform. So I think it's now more than ever that public service broadcasters should be taking the lead.
But that's a little bit like telling the UN to do something. I mean, unless they're compelled by charter or by law, are they really going to do it for many of the reasons that we're discussing? That it's, it's a business of making money. There's other pressures, creative, cultural pressures. So without some sort of edict, how is that going to become reality?
It's not so much about an edict. It's about a conversation, and I think it's about a conversation you have with commissioners from the outset. So when you go in, and I certainly have this. In fact, all of the programmes that came out of STV Studios last year had an element of sustainability and environmentalism in them, whether it be about antiques shows, it might be about killing a whale, it might be about Murder Island, which was a fact-ent show which had an Ian Rankin plot with about sustainability at the heart of it. These things were all discussed at an early point with the commissioners. And I think, and I'm not taking credit for this, it's down to the team that I work with. We all talk about it all the time. It's something that fires us up. So I think it's more about actually, it's empowering the industry rather than necessarily saying that there has to be an edict. And I think it's our responsibility, and in fact, every production company in the country should be looking at this for the next 5-10 years, that every single idea that they talk about should in some way reflect back what's happening in the world.
Okay, well, I think you answered both questions at the same time there.
Thanks.
Give or take,
Brilliant.
so pretty skillfully done.
Good.
Tamali, this is a tricky one for me, right? So I gave a lecture at Cambridge recently, and it was about how a lot of my historical stories were climate stories, but I was too scared to actually admit they were climate stories. So I didn't want to describe myself as an environmental journalist, because environmental journalists were the guys that never got invited to the pub. and that's changed somewhat, only slightly now in newsrooms. But certainly I realised that climate is the author of our doom. It sounds like Spectre, but it's there. It's a thin red line through all of our lives, from the war in Syria to the pandemic. We'll discuss the pandemic in a second. And this is where the hard part for me is, with all my stories around climate, is how dangerous is it that we continue to portray climate narratives through a white Western Hemisphere lens, like a white Glaswegian with a beard that's basically trying to tell the climate story. So, and this is something you really care and are passionate about. I think this is such an important part of the story, that we're inclusive in our approach to climate storytelling.
It is the story. It's the whole story. It's the beginning, the middle, and the end. It's such a multi-strated conversation, honestly, that could take up hours of your time. But white Western narratives are what created the climate crisis. That's why we're all here. Climate is not a magical science problem. Climate is a greed problem. The climate crisis is created out of colonialism. Colonialism created the climate crisis, and capitalism, as Fehinti's pointing out, is continuing to move it along. But we keep asking the same exact voices that got us in this mess to help us figure out how to get out of it. The logic is actually really kind of bonkers, So for a lot of white Western folks, this is your first existential crisis. If you're black or brown, or you're indigenous, or you're a woman, or you're disabled, like, violence, dystopia is a real palpable thing that you are surviving every day. But to have white Western perspectives leading the climate conversation is going to keep it in one small bucket for a really long time, I think. And that's why we've kind of been stuck for a while. The UK specifically has been stuck for a while, because also the UK doesn't know its history yet. It hasn't got there yet. So there's only so far you can really go. The show that I make is on feminist solutions to the climate crisis, and we focus on black and brown and indigenous women and girls all over the world. And the other aspect of that is that climate is a global issue. And so we're also still thinking that we can solve all these problems within national borders, which is also untrue. We have to think about how much diversity exists around the planet that we can pull ideas from, So the women and girls that we speak to, some are celebrity. We've spoken to Bernie Sanders on the show. We've spoken to Stella McCartney on the show. But we also speak to grassroots farmers, Native Americans who are developing solar panel infrastructure, bringing electricity to their communities for the first time ever. Like, we're still sort of humming around this side. Like, we managed to get out of this place where we condescend or ignore people of color. I wholly and completely applaud you all for doing that. But now we're still at this place where it's about tokenization or, just this weird sort of anthropological perspective on people of color and women and, other marginalized people. These are people who have experienced deep trauma and not just are living within it, but surviving it. That is of enormous value. So as much as when people want to come and talk to me about plastics, as much as plastics is adjacent to the climate crisis, for sure, that's the greatest indicator to me that people do not have a fucking clue what climate is.
Because you know what, it's really good. It's because I've got a question here about why the fuck are we talking about plastics? It's actually on the list.
Yes.
It's actually on the list.
Yes.
No offence to anyone that's recycling. I'm going to do we're a wee bit behind, so I'm going to ask all of you to do a quick fire round, and I don't want you to explain it. So we'll start with Lucy from the left. Was COVID or is COVID a climate story?
Climate adjacent story. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Smart.
Sorry, can I have it one
Was
more time?
COVID or is COVID a climate story?
Adjacent. Agree.
Oh, and that's copy.
No, but it's true. It's a zoonotic
Okay,
disease.
climate. You're going to say that as well?
Yes, I would do, definitely.
Say climate adjacent.
I can't explain it though, so
I know.
have to.
I know.
Okay.
Jason.
Climate crisis, climate change, climate catastrophe, climate shift, global warming. Do semantics count? Does it matter what we call it?
Yes, having spent the last year being told by ministers I couldn't use the D word because a pandemic was not a disaster, then yeah, I have a big issue with semantics.
Oh my God, they're such twats.
It's all about semantics for me, yeah.
Okay, good.
Yes, semantics are important, but I think moving from using the term climate change to climate catastrophe, that transition is the thing that is actually the powerful aspect.
Yes, I do. I think it's also about keeping up with a younger generation as well, and whatever anyone else is talking about, we should jump on and talk about it as well, the same way.
Climate catastrophe or climate crisis?
Oh, shit.
See, there's a distinction, and people argue. They argue and argue. I mean, Greenpeace call it something different from the Guardian. They call it different from the BBC. And this is the problem. We don't even know what to call it.
I mean, yeah, I think I agree. Like it's kind of the last thing, isn't it? It's like a conversation, and then you get to a conversation and think, okay, so our level of understanding has changed, so now we're going to call it this. And then you keep going, our level of understanding has changed, and you call it this. So I think semantics are really important as long as they reflect an evolution in the understanding of the thing.
Last one.
It's really unhelpful being at the end of a line of very smart people.
just say what was the.
No, I think catastrophe works, but here's the thing. I think it's from an old rock song, language is a virus. I mean, language is part of the problem because, in a way, it's very easy for everyone to fudge the argument. And I think this is the most complex argument and issue we're dealing with, and it's so easy to circumvent it with language.
So I'm going to stay with you, actually, Stephen, since since you're at the end of the line and you're feeling a bit sorry for a bit there. With the night manager, you tried to tackle. You didn't try. I think you tackled the international arms trade in a way that was certainly to a broad audience. But I think from a narrative approach, that could be told in a more traditional hero and villain approach, right? Is the problem with the climate crisis from a drama perspective is that the climate story is just more opaque? It's just a story that can't be simplified.
Well, can I just say, so it would be immensely smug of me if I suggested that I thought we'd done anything to change the argument with the night manager. I mean, it was Le Carre introduced it as a kind of MacGuffin. He cared very deeply about the arms trade, and we tried to humanize it, we tried to make it felt, but did anyone change their view of the arms trade after watching The Night Manager? I doubt it. I did actually make, 15 years ago, a two-part drama for the BBC called Burn Up, written by Simon Beaufoy, and we were slightly ahead of the game, and it was about, the central character was someone who ran an oil business, and he was trying to bury research about both climate catastrophe, apocalypse issues, and the fact that oil was running out. And the BBC policy unit at the time said we needed to balance the arguments. And so, again, the arguments were undeniable. We were completely muted. We ended up with a balanced argument. And the show didn't work anything like as well as it should have done. And just in terms of other issues, so I also made, back in the 90s, a show for Channel 4 about homelessness called Come On Down and Out. It was a spoof game show, and we basically tricked the viewing public into believing we were making the most tasteless game show ever, where 3 homeless people competed to win a house. I mention these because they're all attempts, if you like, to raise issues, to, yes, I suppose, change behavior. Did any of them work in that sense? No. I think it's tough, but I think, and to your question, climate is the most complex issue. I think if you're dealing with very simple solutions, you look at the soaps, they've done brilliant work, I think, in raising awareness about domestic violence, about controlling relationships. There was a brilliant American campaign where a Harvard professor went to Hollywood and asked all writers, and most of them complied, to introduce the idea of a designated driver into the conversation. This was back in the 80s, to change behavior about drunken driving, which is the biggest cause of death for people between the ages of 18 and 30. And it worked. When Lisa Simpson became a vegetarian in The Simpsons, it changed people's behaviors. There are simple, single issues that can be addressed by television drama cleverly without people feeling hectored. I think this conversation is itself an illustration of the unbelievable complexities of this. And you take Chernobyl, going back to it, for some people who are on the side of the angels, they say nuclear power is something that could take us away from fossil fuels and save the planet. There are other people who say that looming nuclear catastrophe is an equally pernicious threat. So it's really hard to know what even one wants to tell people or share with people or provoke people into doing through drama or any other genre.
Okay. I mean, going back to this idea of the story being, I think the point I was trying to argue is that it's often oversimplistic, and that's maybe a bit harsh. But Lucy, you talk about in your book, and you've talked about it historically, about the heroic portrayal of the heroic portrayal of the NHS during the pandemic being a negative thing. TV always looks for a hero in a crisis. That's kind of dumbing down the story, right? Trying to oversimplify it, perhaps because it is so opaque. But do you see that as a problem?
Yes, and I think it's interesting because actually in disaster management, we are grateful for the Trojan horses that we do see sometimes. So just to pick up on that earlier point, and it's difficult because in the book I also criticise the use of behavioural insight by government departments to sort of sow seeds into broadcasting or particularly into news output of protective behaviour or things we would like to see more. And I think actually the pandemic has probably burnt your bridges with regard to the use of the Trojan horses. I think people are very irritated at the idea that they were manipulated during the pandemic with certain things. So I think there's an interesting thing about the challenge of what stories work. It's interesting with Years and Years. Russell T Davies actually asked for some advice. The team asked for some advice on what the text message would say that goes to everybody in the event of a nuclear leak. And I was asked what's the approved text, and this was about 6-7 years ago, and we didn't have any, and we also didn't have a text alert system. So Years and Years was slightly ahead of its time. But what happened when Years and Years went out was people said, oh, how do I get the text alert system? Which will, of course, be launched across the country in October. So one of the things is, I'm not a mitigation girl. Of course I am in truth and soul, but in terms of where my daily work takes me, I'm an adaptation and I'm at the end, as I say, and when the moment comes. So for you to be ready for what comes next, I need you to get a text alert system. For the Chernobyl, I need you to get a text alert system. I may disagree with the way we phrase it. We'll probably lose 10 hours debating whether we use catastrophe, crisis, major incident, or slight blip, but eventually we'll get you that message.
Or Boris Johnson just accidentally texted one of his girlfriends and said it was the whole country.
Well, and of course in Hawaii a couple of years ago we did see the national alert nuclear message go to everybody, and they forgot to put those 3 vital words, test, 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 on it. So in October, unless I tell you otherwise, it is a test. So I actually am quite interested in the use of selling this more simply. But I'm also very aware that news producers and others don't seem cognizant of some really established tropes in disaster recovery of things to avoid, one of which is the hero and villain narrative. So if you train with the big corporates in crisis comms, they will always say, don't offer up a hero, don't give a hero to this, because the story arc is such the hero will become the villain. And we desperately tried to lobby Department of Health in the early stages to avoid the clap. As we all do, which was don't buy into the Thursday clap. And people were like, you cynical cow. Who doesn't want to clap on a Thursday for our heroes? And we were saying, because it will backfire. This is what 100 years of disaster communications has shown. We like a villain more than we like the hero. The sweet spot, I think, in producing these stories is probably much more, as I'm a big fan of the mundane, much more just there it is, much less shriek. And also what I found really distasteful with the wildfires that we were dealing with last week was immediately pivoting to a climate change reporter from the front charred sitting room of those who had lost their houses. Let the viewer make that link themselves on that one occasion. It did not need to be made. We had got there as viewers. We knew what this was. But let that moment be about the people in the charred furniture of self-lost house. And that I think, listen to the disaster managers on that a bit, because that really shocked us, that instead of making it about that place and those people, the news immediately cut to pieces on, this is you not listening to climate change when your house burns down. And that we've been doing that to many other nations for a long time.
Well, anyone here from Sky who's working on that Cobra show, perhaps you just want a 30-minute segment in the next episode about hobnobs, trying to decide what you're actually going to have with your tea.
It's all about the Jaffa
the mundane matters, right? So I mean, I think one of the we had a really good conversation, Craig, about retrofitting formats and how we can look at some of the programs we love. And maybe trying to tweak them and make them more about climate. And one of the, am I allowed to mention one of them in particular? Because I think you're actually
no.
At the moment. I'm not going to mention that. So
I don't know what he's going to say, but no.
So I mean, how can we look at some of the programs that we have in our orbit and the things that maybe retrofit them? Because Stephen mentioned about the soaps as well. How do you think? I mean, and this is the biggest question, I think. Certainly, climate storytellers like myself, is that from a commissioning perspective, what kind of stories are going to get past the channels? Just answer the second question. The first one isn't even a question.
No, I won't.
Just answer the second one.
I feel I've kind of answered the first question as well. In many respects, I think that we all need to get better at baking in the idea of environmental stories, sustainability, climate change into some of the biggest, most loved brands. I think that is a given. And there's loads and loads of different ways. Sewing Bee do it as well. Love Island with eBay even, using them as a key sponsor, that created conversation and it was picked up in the press and then rolled out. And I think there's lots and lots of different ways like that can be shown. The thing about commissioners, and having been a commissioner and knowing a lot of commissioners, I would say that the thing is that they're always going to be looking for the new story. They're always going to, certainly in the factual world, new story, new science, new revelation, and that's what is ultimately going to pique their interest. So again, and I think that's what's also quite interesting from a factual producer's point of view, is we have to get better journalism. And we have to get better at determining where the stories are coming from, who's telling those stories, so it doesn't just feel like it's the same old news presenter who's been put in front of the box, and find new ways of telling the stories that some people might feel that they already know, but we know that this is an area of science that is changing at a rate of knots. The revelations in terms of solutions, new science, everything else, it is absolutely ripe for pitching. I just don't think enough people are pitching it, and they're certainly not they're certainly not pitching it in mainstream ideas. And sorry, just to finish that, as somebody who was looking after science and natural history commissioning for the BBC, I didn't get enough of it. And that's shocking, even though it was a few years ago now, and I left 3 years ago. But I think there's a couple of commissioners in here who might be able to tell me otherwise. But how many people come and actually talk about environmental ideas? I don't think it'll be that many.
Well, certainly when we pitch climate documentary ideas, there's a lot of resistance, and the ideas aren't shit. Well, they may be bad, right? But I think fundamentally there is this fear, I think. There's a fear of commissioning something that's going to fail, or it's almost like you're being set up to fail, right?
I think also it is worth saying in the same breath, look at where we're at and how quickly it has changed in a relatively short period of time, because when I was in commissioning and we were commissioning environmental programmes, we sent crews around the world to cover the story. That's outrageous. And we shouldn't have done that. But we didn't know, well, we did know better, but at the same time, we were still playing to this whole, how do we get a bigger audience to come and engage with it? That's not the way they're done anymore. That's not how it's working. So actually, I do think we have made great changes, great swathes of change, partly down to Albert, partly down to getting people to really think about it, have the conversation early. It's a conversation now that certainly within our teams we're having with the editorial team and the production team. It's not just a box-ticking exercise at the end of the production to try and get your Albert certification. It means that we are all thinking about it, and that is something that hasn't been done for, well, sorry, that has changed quite quickly.
So our superpower is storytelling and not recycling plastic bottles, although we do have plastic bottles here, I hope they're recyclable. So Tamale, and then we're going to have to get some Q&As. The red thing you can see there is someone telling me my earpiece has fallen out, 10 minutes remaining, but I actually took it out because it was annoying me, so that's why the reason.
You're Robbie Williams.
Yeah, exactly. So Tamale, I think one of the things that we're kind of navel gazing here a little bit. You run a wonderful podcast. Do you think that like podcasts and other media genres are getting it right and leaving the more broadcast elements behind? TV?
Oh my God, yeah, without question.
Good for you.
Yeah, no, TV is like years and years behind still. It's years and years behind, unfortunately. But it's coming. I know it's coming. I know that interest is coming. Pods, when I started working on the show, it was 2019. Mothers of Invention launched in 2018 in the UK. I live in New York. They wanted to, the executive producers knew that climate was kicking off that year. We moved it to the States to talk about it more. But at that time, there were hardly any climate pods actually still. And the ones that did exist were deep doom and gloomism. And in my experience working on the show, you can maybe get an audience, 5% of an audience with the science, like an actual visceral reaction to the science. And then maybe another 10% on doom and gloomism, where they actually get up off their butts and go do something. Which is important to me because I'm writing editorial strategy and social justice impact strategy for the show. So I'm thinking about how I can get the women that we feature on the show to have more opportunities and to try and figure out how audience can participate more. But everybody else needs something to walk towards, you know? We have to help visualize what happens next for people. And so that's what our pod kind of did to sort of change the game a little bit, is we actually laughed out loud a lot. And because that existed, I'm going to take some credit here, but there has been a lot more humor injected into the climate movement. It has had more women in it. There are more people of color showing up to it. And pods, even after broadcast television shows up and film shows up, I think pods will continue on because you can have those sort of gritty, messy conversations, and people do appreciate that. Whereas though TV and film can be sort of finite things, but pods, like in my experience, pods being a serialized project as opposed to film, which does have, there are impact-led climate films, but the pod being a serialized show, we have an opportunity to actually help an audience follow along with us. So.
Okay. So we actually have some questions that have come through here, and the initial plan was for everyone here in the panel to answer 4 questions, and we could probably do this easily for another hour, probably just amongst ourselves, no audience, just sitting at this. But one of the questions that's coming through, and it's interesting as well, talking about doom and gloom, which has been my stock in trade as a foreign correspondent, but how do you create hope on climate issues without distorting the facts? How do you tell a hopeful story, Stephen?
Thanks so much, Dan, for putting that one to me. It's really tough. I mean, I think it's like if anyone studied English literature at schools, happy poems are so much more annoying than miserable ones. And the same is true of literature. And you know, many of us are drawn to the dark, drawn to dark stories. They're more compelling. They're more emotionally engaging. I think hope is tough, but I agree it's utterly incumbent upon us to suggest that there is hope. I've been having conversations recently with sort of friends and relatives about, you know, the generations coming through, some of whom represent in this audience, who, you know, just seriously talking about not wanting to have children because what is the world that they would be bringing these children into? And that's a sad conversation to have. And we who have been complicit, if you like, in creating this mess. It's incumbent on us to try and shine a light out. Those stories are really hard to find, but do I look for them? Sure I do. I mean, I think your point about comedy is actually a really valuable one, and going back to the Simpsons episode I mentioned about vegetarianism, using comedy to make those very tough arguments about why meat is going to tear us all apart was fabulous and brilliant. And I think going back to what I was trying to say earlier about changing the political climate, I mean, it's very hard to satirize what's happening in this country politically, because everything you think of, they do something more bizarre and idiotic than even satirists can come up with.
Well, it's like Veep-ending because it was beyond satire.
Yes, but I think we've got to find a way, and comedy, I think, is the way through it, to make it impossible for people who are running for any positions of power, take running the country for one, where climate change is not top of their agenda. It's, what is it, 7th or 8th in both kind of the two contenders for the Tory leadership. It's bleak beyond imagining. And how have we allowed that to happen? It's incumbent on us to do that. And I think when we create a situation where you can't seek to run the country unless that is top of your agenda, that's the way we'll create hope. But I think whether we're telling fictional stories as dramatists or factual stories, we have to find a way of doing it. But it's not easy. I'd love to say it was.
Okay, Fehinti, you've worked with you work with Extinction Rebellion and some of their campaigns, and do you think that hope can perhaps be found in the activist story? Hope that, we're talking about simplifying the climate story, but the hero is the activist, or if anyone has read Ministry for the Future, I really recommend the book. I've been telling these guys to read it. And that's a hopeful story that is embedded in activism. Do you think that giving the activists more of a voice, the dissent, is a hopeful story? At the moment it's being criticised by right-wing, obviously, press, as you would expect, but do you think there's a more hopeful story in there we could use, we can work with?
Yeah, it's quite funny, words like activists and activism. Just going back to your point earlier about heroes and villains and labels. Labels are really interesting because what is an activist, really, other than sort of like an active participant or active citizen? And within that, there are just like very simple narratives in that are like working with the community, mutual aid, thinking about the most vulnerable people in that community, giving them space. I do think there's hope in that, but like I often talk about hope as a verb. Like you really do have to fuel it and work with it and remake it. And I'm a little bit concerned that throughout this panel, the way we've talked about going forward sort of still runs within the same structures. I think what shocked me about this panel, not that it's a bad thing at all, but just without my experience, is as an actor, you kind of see yourself as like the smallest person, and you always see the person above you who has more power and money, but there's always a person above that person who has more power and money, and a person above that person has more power and money. And I think it's great we're talking about all the different things, but also we also talk about working within the structure that caused the problem in the first place. And it feels like everybody here is really struggling to think of a restructure because you don't have the money all the time or the power. And that for me is really shocking, actually, because that's what we need. So in answer to your question, yeah, I think there is quote unquote hope in activist narratives, but only because they provide an alternative structure. And that structure needs more time and understanding and looking at. And the fact that I talk about it as an alien thing is bizarre, because we won't succeed within the structure that has failed us already.
Okay, so Lucy, I guess going back to this idea, and we've only got 4 minutes, so I want everyone to quickly speak. We're talking, one of the things we're going to discuss was 24-hour news and the problem that creates, talking about structures. Living in a 24-hour news cycle, is hell. And it's not really a great way to cover disaster, and during the recent drought, 1 minute it was fun in the sun, then a village in Essex burned down and it was the apocalypse. So the idea of 24-hour news it needs to be ripped up and started again, is distorting how we cover crisis. What do you think about that?
I don't think it's it's going anywhere, but it's certainly not helping, would be my shorter answer. It's fundamentally changing, I think, how we are engaging with the science. And as a scientist who's asked to give contributions, the pandemic, I don't think, because we're still inside it, we're still trying to realise the shock it has, we haven't taken all our lessons identified and teachable moments from how we engaged with people like me in the pandemic, which was very much to consume them, to demand of them a very short moment, to ask them a question that wasn't the question that they've been told they were going to be asked, and then to say things like, we know that's your area and you tweet about it, but if you could make sure this segment's very positive. And in fact, Sam Montano in the final chapter of Disasterology says, don't try and bring hope into the climate change debate. That is a sort of false beacon. And When the Dust Settles, I give you little reasons to stay hoping, very much agreeing with the verb, and to keep going and to wake up every morning. But I'm not a hopiate dealer. I'm not looking for hope all the time. I only see the reasonable worst case scenario. That's where I operate. It is a degree rise. It is that we don't meet any of our targets, and then we start to lose a lot more than we're already losing. So for me, I think there's a real challenge at the moment. I actually, part of me as a good Scouser would like 24 News to just calm down.
That's a really bad pun. I'm sorry. I just off.
I'm just alienated entire.
I'm being told.
I'm never allowed back.
I'm being told we've got 1 minute, and I was also told I couldn't ask questions from the audience, but I'm going to do it anyway. So let's go for it, and then Craig can answer it, and Tamale.
It's just an observation,
of course,
more than a question. I think climate change is the symptom, and we should be looking at the cause. I think it's how do you smash the patriarchy? That's what we need to question in drama, in documentary, in podcasts. You don't need to tell anybody how bad it is when your house burns down. But it's the patriarchal structures and logic that underpin all this and all the related things that go with it.
You definitely grew up in the same town as me. But Fehinti, what would you?
Tamale.
Sorry, Tamale. Sorry, I'm soaking. Do you know? I'm thinking that just sounds like my grandfather. Actually, so he's saying that to me all my life. But you're too young to be my grandfather. But Tamale, I was distracted. So please, obviously.
To respond to you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how amazing it is to hear that question from a white man sitting in the UK. It means something to me. So
I also think it's time for men to step up to the plate. Women have been there for years doing it, your mother, your sister.
you can applaud to that, definitely.
So this is what we should be making.
Okay, good. We're starting that. Good for you. Okay, so one more question. I'd like Craig to answer it, because I have OCD and believe in symmetry and the circle being closed. So if anyone has a specific question, then I'm willing to take it from the floor, or I can use one of these. Anyone? Nerves? Okay, no one's taking it. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a final one to end. The Greta effect, was it a force for good, or did people just end up getting fed up with it?
To go right back to the very, very beginning when we were talking about celebrity and where you use celebrity, and Greta has become a celebrity. And I think when you hear my kids talk about Greta and you see the impact that she has had on their lives, I would say the Greta effect then for the next generation has been a force for good. Because it is really, really they're teaching me stuff that I didn't know, and that has come from Greta. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a force for good.
Okay, well, guys, listen, thank you so much. I'd like to, if you can join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, and I'm sorry we don't have more time. Thanks for coming.
Oh, Dan, meet the group.